Elvis was driving through downtown Memphis on Christmas Eve when he saw something that made him pull over immediately. A family was sitting on the sidewalk in the freezing cold, surrounded by all their belongings, while a man in an expensive suit was nailing boards over their apartment door. When Elvis learned that the family included a disabled Korean War veteran and his 3 young children, and that they were being evicted on Christmas Eve because they couldn't afford a rent increase, he asked one question. What kind of man throws a veteran's family onto the street on Christmas? What happened next didn't just save one family. It destroyed the most ruthless slumlord in Memphis and established tenant protection laws that spread across America. It was December 24th, 1967, and Elvis was returning from delivering Christmas presents to local charities when he noticed a commotion on Beale Street. A small crowd had gathered around what appeared to be an eviction in progress. Elvis parked his car and walked closer to see what was happening. On the sidewalk, sitting on a torn mattress and surrounded by boxes, furniture, and personal belongings, was a family of 5. The father appeared to be in his 30s, but he was sitting in a wheelchair. The mother was holding a baby while trying to comfort 2 other small children who were crying in the December cold. Standing over them with a clipboard and a hammer was a well-dressed man who was clearly enjoying the family's misery. "You had your chance to pay," the man was saying loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I gave you 3 days' notice. Now you're out. And I don't want to see you on my property again." Elvis recognized the man immediately. It was Samuel Morrison, one of Memphis's most notorious slumlords. Morrison owned over 200 rental properties, most of them substandard housing rented to poor families at inflated prices. Morrison was known for ruthless business practices, sudden rent increases, threats of eviction, and no mercy for tenants who fell behind. He targeted military families, immigrants, and single mothers because they had fewer options. Elvis approached the family sitting on the sidewalk. "Ma'am," he said gently to the woman holding the baby, "what's happening here?" The woman looked up and Elvis could see that she had been crying. "We're being evicted," she said quietly. "We couldn't make the new rent payment." The man in the wheelchair spoke up. "I'm Robert Jenkins," he said, extending his hand. "This is my wife, Carol, and these are our kids, Tommy, Susan, and little Mary." Elvis shook Robert's hand and knelt down to be at eye level with the family. "Robert, are you a veteran?" "Yes, sir. Korea. Lost the use of my legs in 1953 at Heartbreak Ridge." Elvis felt his anger building, but he kept his voice calm. "How long have you been living in this apartment?" 3 years, Carol answered. "We've never missed a rent payment until this month." "What happened this month?" Robert's voice was filled with shame and frustration. "Mr. Morrison raised our rent from $45 a month to $85 a month, said it was a property improvement fee. But nothing in the apartment has been improved. The heat barely works, the plumbing leaks, and there's mold on the walls." Elvis looked at the apartment building behind them. It was clearly run down, with broken windows, peeling paint, and steps that looked unsafe. "We tried to explain that I only get $73 a month in disability payments," Robert continued. "Even with Carol's part-time job cleaning houses, we couldn't come up with the extra money. Mr. Morrison said that wasn't his problem." Samuel Morrison had been standing nearby, supervising the eviction process, when he noticed Elvis talking to the Jenkins family. Morrison recognized Elvis immediately and saw an opportunity for some good publicity. "Mr. Presley," Morrison called out, walking over with his hand extended. "What a pleasant surprise. I'm Samuel Morrison. I own this property and several others throughout Memphis." Elvis stood up but didn't shake Morrison's hand. "Mr. Morrison, you're evicting this family on Christmas Eve?" Morrison's smile faltered slightly. "Business is business, Mr. Presley. Tenants need to understand that rent payments are not optional." "This man is a disabled veteran," Elvis said. "That's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the terms of his lease. He agreed to pay rent, and he hasn't paid." Elvis looked at the lease that Morrison was holding. "May I see that contract?" Morrison reluctantly handed over the paperwork. Elvis read through it quickly and realized immediately what was happening. The original lease was for $45 per month, but there was a clause that allowed Morrison to raise the rent with only 30 days' notice for any reason he deemed necessary. The rent increase was legal, but it was clearly designed to force out tenants who couldn't afford the higher payments. "Mr. Morrison," Elvis said, "this rent increase is more than double the original amount. How is a family on a fixed income supposed to handle that?" Morrison's voice became cold. "That's not my concern. If they can't afford to live here, they should find somewhere else." "On Christmas Eve? With 3 small children and a disabled father?" "The calendar is irrelevant to business decisions," Morrison replied. Elvis looked around at the crowd that had gathered. He could see other families from the building watching nervously, probably wondering if they would be next. "Mr. Morrison, what would it take for this family to stay in their apartment?" Morrison sensed an opportunity to make money from the famous musician. "Well, Mr. Presley, if someone were willing to pay the $85 per month going forward, plus the $40 they owe for this month, they could certainly remain." Elvis pulled out his wallet and counted out $125 in cash. "Here's 3 months' rent in advance. Now, let this family back into their apartment." Morrison took the money eagerly, but his expression suggested he wasn't finished with the Jenkins family. "Of course, Mr. Presley. I should mention that I'm planning some major improvements to this building in the coming year. The rent will likely need to be adjusted again to cover the costs." Elvis realized that Morrison was going to keep raising the rent until he drove the family out regardless of who was paying. "What kind of improvements?" Elvis asked. Morrison shrugged. "New paint, better lighting, general maintenance. Whatever the building needs to maintain its value." Elvis looked at the building again. The improvements Morrison was describing were basic maintenance that any responsible landlord should have been doing all along. But Morrison was using them as an excuse to drive out families who couldn't afford constant rent increases. That's when Elvis made a decision that would change both Morrison's life and the rental housing market in Memphis. "Mr. Morrison," Elvis said, "I'd like to make you an offer for this building." Morrison's eyes lit up with greed. "It's not for sale, Mr. Presley." "Everything's for sale at the right price. How much do you want for it?" Morrison thought for a moment, clearly trying to calculate how much he could get from the famous musician. "This building is worth at least $15,000, Morrison said. Elvis knew the building wasn't worth half that amount in its current condition, but he didn't care. "I'll give you $20,000 cash right now for this building and a complete list of all your other rental properties in Memphis." Morrison couldn't believe what he was hearing. $20,000 was more money than he'd make from the building in 5 years of rent collection. "You want a list of my other properties too?" "I'm thinking about expanding into real estate," Elvis said. "I want to know what else you've got available." Morrison's greed overcame his caution. Within 2 hours, Elvis had not only purchased the Jenkins family's building, but had also obtained detailed information about every property in Morrison's rental empire. But Elvis wasn't planning to become a landlord. Over the next 6 months, Elvis systematically purchased every building Samuel Morrison owned, 47 properties in total. He paid well above market value for each one, which Morrison was happy to accept. By summer 1968, Morrison had sold his entire real estate portfolio to Elvis for nearly $400,000. Morrison thought he had made the deal of a lifetime, selling rundown properties for far more than they were worth. What Morrison didn't realize was that Elvis was waging economic warfare. As soon as Elvis gained ownership of each building, he began massive renovations. He updated electrical systems, installed new plumbing, replaced broken windows, and made safety improvements Morrison had neglected. More importantly, Elvis drastically reduced rents. Properties Morrison had rented for $80 to $100 per month were now available for $35 to $45 per month. The impact was devastating. Morrison had sold Elvis his profitable properties and was left with only the worst buildings in his portfolio. But Morrison's remaining tenants began demanding the same improvements they were seeing in Elvis's buildings. When Morrison refused, families moved out of his properties and into Elvis's renovated apartments. Within 6 months, Morrison's remaining buildings were empty, while Elvis's properties had waiting lists. Morrison tried to compete by lowering rents and making improvements, but he had already spent the money from selling to Elvis. He couldn't afford the necessary renovations. By 1969, Samuel Morrison was bankrupt. He went from owning over 200 properties to owning nothing. He was forced to sell his home and move out of Memphis. But Elvis's impact went far beyond just destroying one slumlord. The renovations Elvis made to his 47 buildings set a new standard for rental housing in Memphis. Other landlords were forced to improve their properties or lose tenants to Elvis's better-maintained, lower-priced apartments. Elvis also established the Graceland Housing Foundation, which provided low-interest loans to families who wanted to buy their own homes instead of renting. The foundation helped over 300 families become homeowners between 1968 and 1975. More importantly, Elvis worked with Memphis city officials to establish new tenant protection laws. The Elvis Housing Standards, passed in 1970, required all rental properties to meet minimum safety and maintenance standards. The legislation also prohibited retaliatory rent increases. Landlords could no longer raise rent specifically to drive out tenants they didn't like. Any rent increase had to be justified by actual improvements to the property, and tenants had the right to dispute unreasonable increases. Robert and Carol Jenkins were among the first families to benefit from Elvis's housing revolution. They lived in their renovated apartment for 5 more years before purchasing their own home with help from the Graceland Housing Foundation. Robert Jenkins became a volunteer advocate for disabled veterans' housing rights. "Elvis didn't just help our family," Robert said in a 1975 interview. "He showed us that people with power can choose to use it for good instead of evil. Mr. Morrison saw my disability as weakness to exploit. Elvis saw it as a reason to help." Carol Jenkins added that Christmas Eve could have been the worst night of our lives. Our children could have spent Christmas sleeping in a car or a shelter. Instead, it became the beginning of a better life for our whole family. Samuel Morrison never recovered from his financial collapse. He moved to a small town in Arkansas, where he worked as a used car salesman until his retirement. In a 1985 interview, he was asked about his confrontation with Elvis. "I thought I was smart," Morrison said. "I thought I had outsmarted Elvis Presley and made a fortune, but he wasn't trying to make money off me. He was trying to put me out of business, and it worked." When asked if he regretted his treatment of tenants like the Jenkins family, Morrison's answer revealed that he had learned little from his experience. "I was running a business, not a charity," he said. "Maybe I was too harsh sometimes, but that's how you survive in real estate." The housing standards Elvis established in Memphis became a model nationwide. By 1975, similar tenant protection laws had been passed in over 30 states. The concept that housing was a human right gained national support. Elvis's 47 buildings remained affordable housing for decades. When Elvis died in 1977, ownership transferred to a nonprofit foundation that continues providing low-cost housing. Today, there's a small park in Memphis called Jenkins Square, named after Robert and Carol Jenkins. A plaque reads, "In memory of Elvis Presley, who understood that home is a basic human need, not a luxury to be priced out of reach." The story of Elvis, the Jenkins family, and Samuel Morrison reminds us that economic power can be used for good or evil. Morrison used his wealth to exploit vulnerable families, driving them into homelessness for profit. Elvis used his wealth to protect those families and create lasting change. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons, but with property deeds and rental contracts. Elvis proved that one person with resources and compassion could take on an entire industry and win, not just for themselves, but for hundreds of families who needed someone to fight for their right to safe, affordable housing. The Jenkins family never forgot that their better life began with a stranger who cared enough to stop his car and ask what was wrong. Sometimes that's all it takes, someone willing to see injustice and decide to do something about it. If this incredible story of housing justice and standing up to exploitation moved you, make sure to subscribe for more amazing true stories about using wealth and influence to help others. Share this with someone who works in housing, social services, or who has experienced the stress of housing insecurity. Have you ever seen someone use their resources to help families in need? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to hit that notification bell for more inspiring stories about fighting for basic human rights.